All right, everybody, we're going to kick it off here. So thank you for joining, and thank you to the presenters for putting this great content together. Just wanted to welcome everybody if this is their first time, and welcome you back if you've been a part of this series. Definitely encourage you to check out the ones that we've hosted prior to the lacrosse one we'll talk about today. All those can be found on the Catapult community website. And have a list of 10 plus episodes so far with a lot of great content focused on different sports. Today we have Tim Murray, as well as Justin Kilian. Both of them will be talking about monitoring and load monitoring within the sport of lacrosse. So very specific here, but I think it's going to be able to provide some great insight. So with the first presenter up, we have Tim. Tim joins us from University of Denver, where he is the sports performance assistant coach. He works with men's lacrosse at Denver under Matt Shaw, and has worked with the S5s that we have as a product, right? Prior to that, he's been at Boston University for a number of years. And then he's also worked under Mike Boyle, which I'm sure anybody in the S&C industry knows of. He's very well renowned. So wanted to welcome in Tim, who's going to be talking about the integration of load monitoring for the sport of lacrosse. Tim, welcome and thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And today we're going to, like you said, talk about integration in load monitoring for the sport of lacrosse, giving just kind of practical application, get a little bit into the science of things, but I want to keep it kind of context specific and make sure you guys can kind of come away with something today. And like I said in the introduction, past experiences. So was at Mike Boyle Strength and Conditioning, also at his Thrive affiliate facility. Was at Boston University as an intern under Glenn Harris, as well as a GA. I got my master's there. Worked with the lacrosse team there for my entire time. I was fortunate enough to be hired full time there after my master's degree. And then in between those 2 years, during my master's degree, I had the opportunity to intern under Chris Doyle at University of Iowa football. And then that power goal in the bottom right. So I played football and lacrosse at Endicott College, as well as helping Sean Cork out there with as a student assistant with the strength and conditioning for the lacrosse team. And that kind of brings me to my current position at Denver. You guys will see in this presentation, a lot of this is influenced through Matt Shaw, who's been a huge mentor for me. He's the one who allowed me the opportunity to work here, and then also pretty much taught me everything I know about using load monitoring and Catapult. And then obviously creating some of my own nuances within the sport of lacrosse specifically. I just want to thank Catapult and Ben Slingerland for giving me the opportunity to speak to you guys today. Really appreciate that. And hopefully you guys come away with something new today. So for the goals for today, want to create context behind the workflow and integration. So just giving you guys context into how we specifically use the wearables at University of Denver, specifically with lacrosse, because it does vary from how we use it with other sports. And then encourage thought behind integration of monitoring. So the application piece, which is at the end of the day, most places, most universities or organizations aren't lucky enough to have an entire sports science department. So the application that we're going to talk about today is kind of how we integrate it as sports performance coaches, and kind of managing all of the sports science data and what that looks like. And then learn. So hopefully you guys leave with at least just one thing that you can kind of immediately take with you or create change, whether you have wearables or not. I think that hopefully today gives you guys some insight into some stuff that you can take away immediately. So just to create some context, guys, so environmental, so the environment that I work within, roughly 55-man roster. That's probably going to grow after this COVID situation with the transfers and the portals and all that going on, but pretty big roster. And we track 28 of the roughly 55 people on the team. So 28 Catapult units distributed across the team. Just over 2-year user with the University of Denver men's lacrosse team, with the Catapult wearables. We're fortunate enough to have, fellows and interns aid in the management of all sports science integration. And then we also have very, very, very receptive coaching staff. So especially with the men's lacrosse staff, they're very receptive to feedback. They're receptive to kind of taking this stuff into account when we're managing stress for the athletes, whether it's off season or in season. And then we have usage for all home practices and competitions, and some limited travel usage as well. And then some personal context. So who am I? A coach first, so sports performance coach first, and then sports science second. So using the data we get from all of our sports science material and tech to create change and integration within the sport of lacrosse. So managing, coaching, and developing the human before the data, but the data drives a lot of those decisions. So in terms of the workflow integration, I'm at all the practices. So every practice, I'm there for warm up, and then I'm tracking all the drill times. So making sure that from warm up all the way to the end of the practice, each drill time is tagged specifically to the time that the stress is applied in the practice. And then post practice, bringing those units inside, uploading the data, tagging the drills, and then that leads us to reviewing the individual and team data. From there, we just send a simple PDF out to the coaches right out of the Catapult interface, and that kind of leads us to our communication piece. So sending that training report with recommendations, and then that following morning, going up to the coach's office and discussing that subsequent practice to make sure that our stresses are undulating and flowing properly through the week, which we'll get into during this presentation. So just before we get into kind of the nuts and bolts of all this, I want to start with kind of a perspective of stress. So, if we have S&C coaches or ATs, this is something that's obviously very normalized for us. But, for the vast majority of people, what we see with stress is the practice and the lift, and then what we see in terms of what the athlete is doing. And that's kind of the tip of the iceberg. So the other things that are going on, our central nervous system just knows stress is stress. It doesn't know if it's class, social, nutrition, tactical efficiency. We have skill in there, sleep, motivation, and all those other things that come into the athlete's life that add to their stress volumes. Those are other things that we need to consider when we have our perspective of stress. But the wearables give us great insight into the practice, the competition, and anything the athlete's doing in regards to their sport, so we can kind of account for that part of the stress volume. So optimal versus best. So one way I kind of look at this is optimal. I kind of look at that, I call it like the lab coat. So optimal is something that you see in a lab. So it requires that all stimulus, recovery, adaptations to that stimulus are all lined perfectly in a completely controlled environment. So realistically, that doesn't really happen in real life. What we're dealing with is best. So like I started out with in my introduction, I'm a sports performance coach, so I'm in charge of performance management, return to play, all those other things. And I'm also in charge of managing the sports science integration within my teams. So best just requires that interdepartmental communication is combined with the context and environment of the athlete. And what we're trying to do with that is we're trying to move the biggest rocks here. So the biggest influencers that will alter readiness for competition and manage fatigue. So in the context of the wearables, taking the acute data and stress from that day, looking at it more chronically through a week and a season, and making sure that we're kind of within our norms and we're kind of undulating stress properly so that the athlete's feeling optimally prepared on game day. So the big rocks that we're going to kind of go over today, obviously the overarching emphasis is the integration of data. And then we're going to delve into kind of the coach education side, implications in the weight room, and then we're going to wrap it up with some athlete education and what that looks like from a lifestyle management perspective. So the first block we're going to go through coach education. So undulation of stress, daily practice structure, drill selection. And just to give kind of a broad bird's eye view of stress for an athlete in season. So obviously we all know there's 168 hours in a week, 2.5 hours dedicated to meetings and video, 9 hours per week roughly dedicated towards practice, roughly 3 hours for competition, and roughly an hour and a half per week for lift. And then just giving kind of a normalized 2 hours for extra work and anything else that the athlete's doing in regards to their sport. So totals, we're looking at about 18 hours a week dedicated towards lacrosse. And if we look at that in an even further kind of broad spectrum, 8 to 9% of that time is spent lifting in season, while almost 70% of the time is spent on the field playing. So that is why it's so important that we track the mechanical workload of the athlete, because 70% of that time that they're doing things regarding their sport is them having a physiological stimulus on the field. So that's why it's so important to track this stuff and have this data and retroactively and proactively look at it through a week in a season. And then if we look at that again, it's only about 10% of the time in the week is spent doing anything related to the sport. So that leaves 90% of the week the athlete is not with the strength coach, ATs, any of the sport coaches, and they're just kind of on their own. So the wearables give us a snapshot into the portion of the athlete's stress during the week. So about that other 90%, that's where we rely so much on our culture. And this is really a top-down approach. So we, like I said, we have a very receptive coaching staff. They're huge in making sure that we're, the athletes are hearing what we want them to hear in terms of their lifestyle management. And that leads to a culture of education, intent, leadership, lifestyle management, and all these factors create change outside of that 10% of stress. I just put a little visual here from The Slight Edge. It's one of my favorite books. So it talks about the 5% of success, responsibility, discipline, and value-driven. And then the 95% of failure, blame, neglect, entitled. So we really, really focus on that 5% of success and doing all those things correctly, and that 90% of the week that the athletes aren't with us. So now we're going to kind of delve into the nuts and bolts. So the metrics, we look at team and individual. So for the team, we're looking at volume, so player load, total distance, the density, which is those metrics broken down per minute. High force velocity metrics, so high IMA, jumping, high speed running, explosive efforts, and then practice duration. From an individual perspective, we're looking at all those metrics, but they're color coded off of their 20-day rolling average so that we can kind of have relative norms. And then positional differences by drills, so volume totals, and then again, densities to the stress per minute, and then high force and velocity. So first thing we talked about, the team reports. So this is the first page of the PDF that our coaches will get. So in the top left, you can see the team average player load. And then you're looking at defense, attack, and midfield. And you can kind of look at those relative to the team average to see and give insight into what the individual positions saw for that day. In the red graph, you can see the average player load and player load per minute. So the total will be the red bar, and the black trend line will be the density of that day. So you can kind of look into a week breakdown. So you can see right here with the men's lax versus Duke, and then men's lax versus UNC, and kind of work backwards to see what reactively what that week looked like in terms of undulating stress. And the same holds true down here for the team average high speed distance. So our goal in the week is to make sure that we apply stress properly and then taper it down so that they can kind of peak for that game day, Saturday, Sunday. And then moving towards individual data. So all those metrics broken down by individual. Obviously, I included the names for the purpose of the presentation, but each one of these rows will represent one athlete. Looking at per minute, so density here on the left, and then totals here on the right. And it's color-coded based off of a dark red, orange, yellow, light green, and then a darker green. So those are just showing us deviations from their norm. So based on 20 days of activities, what is that athlete's norm in terms of player load, high speed distance, and total distance, and how far are they deviating from that on that given day? So obviously the dark red will be a far deviation, so a higher stress level, whereas a green or a dark green will be a lower under stress level throughout the week. So this allows us just to give insight into the individuals and where they're at during the week. And then lastly, looking at position differences by drills. So here on the left, those are our tag drills for that day. And then it's broken into defense, long stick midi, D midfielder, midi, and then attack. And then we're looking at the player load and the high speed distance within each one of those drills. And then here on the right, we're looking at defense, attack, midfield for high speed distance and average distance broken down. So now drill structure. So here on the left, we can see the average duration of a drill and then the player load per minute, so the density of that drill. So what this allows us to do is it gives us kind of a logging of drill selection. So when we go into a coach's meeting, and you saw in that kind of workflow chart I put in the first slide, that follow-up meeting allows us to kind of pull on drills. And You know, obviously I work with Coach Tierney. He's been doing this before I was even born. So I'm not going to tell him anything he doesn't already know, but it does allow us to kind of make sure that we're properly applying stress during the inter and intra practice metrics during the week and season. And that's huge for us to make sure guys are feeling fresh on Saturday, Sunday game days, and also to make sure we're reducing the likelihood of injury during the week. So that this is the kind of drill selection for a given day. And then if you look here on the left, we're looking at player load per minute. We're looking at total distance per minute, high speed distance per minute, and then trimp per minute, as well as total stress here on the bottom. And that allows us just to get insight into what each drill looked like in terms of the relative stress of the practice as a whole. So now we're looking at intra-practice structure. So this graph kind of shows us what a typical rough outline of a practice will look like. As you can see, as the practice goes on, doesn't take a rocket scientist to know that fatigue is going to set in and increase throughout the practice. So what that means is after warm-up, we want to do our skill and technical acquisition at the start of that day when the athlete's fresh, the same way that we would structure a lifting session where you put your jumps, plyometrics, your explosive movements, your speed work at the start. You don't do that stuff under fatigue. So it's kind of the same concept here. And then moving into high-speed drills, so things where they're putting in tactical and technical acquisition into a live setting. And then moving towards just strict tactical work and then finishing off with some work capacity. So this typical day here looks like warm-up, stick work, full field clearing drill, then moving into a full field scrimmage where they're combining everything into a live competitive session. And then half field drill and EMO, EMD working on tactical work, and then work capacity, moving towards potential extra conditioning at the end of practice. So inter-practice schedule. So what we're looking at in terms of a full week. So this -5 to -1 would represent a Monday through Friday going into a Saturday game. So that -5 down here is going to look at the Monday typically after a weekend game. So 5 days before competition, pretty moderate volumes, moderate high speed. EE represents explosive efforts. And it's kind of an aerobic flush practice. -4 days out from competition, it's our highest volume practice, moderate volume of high speed and explosive efforts. And then -2, -3. So those are 2 to 3 days before competition. That's when we're really combining, you know, coaches going through film, scouting for the subsequent competition, and making sure that we're applying this stuff into full field or partial field drill settings where our high volume of speed and explosive efforts are pretty high. So -1 day from competition. So that's the Friday before Saturday game, for example. Very consistent routine. It's kind of a confidence practice. The guys know what to expect. And the drill structure doesn't really vary too much. So we're looking at about half, 50% of game stress for that day. And the weekly design for all of this can be flexible based on the competition dates or type of competition, bye week, you know, if it's NCAAs, if it's Big East tournament, things like that. But that's kind of a general outline of what that would look like. And then lastly, big important point here. So weekly accumulated stress shouldn't deviate more than plus or minus 15% during a given week. So just want to make sure we drove home that point. So next, kind of working towards the implications in the weight room, we're going to look at volume, time of year, weekly structure, and individual management. So just like in practice, when we want to make sure we're aligning stressors and, you know, a Monday to Monday is going to look the same week to week, a Tuesday to Tuesday, so on and so forth. And we want to make sure that those stresses are aligned. We do the same thing in the weight room. So Mondays, like I said, that's a -5. It's more aerobic, higher repetition of extensive technical and tactical work. The guys will come in. I typically will have high minute guys come in before practice to lift. And then this can also lead to a discussion in utilizing Catapult to see, you know, certain positions or individuals who chronically have shown higher than normal relative norms on their data. They might come in before practice to lift as well. But that Monday lift, we're looking to restore range of motion, higher time under tension since we have some more time to recover before competition. Our power work, jump work, any explosive work is going to be longer coupling. So using loaded jumps, using things that are going to have a longer ground contact time. And then it's a higher volume of general strength qualities. It's a very structural lifting day. It's a good time to get a lot of our prehab work in during the structural block in our tier. And then once we move towards Wednesdays, so that's our minus 2-3. The practice, like I said before, is high speed pace of practice. It's a very competitive structure. So that's when we're really aligning a lot of the tactical work and film and all that stuff for a subsequent competition. And we're applying it into drills. So again, aligning stressors, once they get into the weight room, I want to mimic that kind of trend in the weight room. So we're working more specific joint angles at peak relative power. So we're working peak relative power, speed, strength, ballistics, more elastic work. We're not really putting the muscle under a lot of tension to reduce some soreness. And we're putting more emphasis on outputs such as velocity, acceleration, big systemic qualities that'll kind of act as a neural primer going into the game for that week. So we'll go through just a couple of the other technologies we use in the weight room. So GymAware, we're doing a daily assessment of the athlete's strength levels based on their MVT. So essentially just making sure that the velocity and the percent bar load is matching. And also, Catapult allows us to get insight into kind of chronic workloads and, we're taking recovery, we're taking nutrition, all those other things that are coming into play to allow for the athlete's readiness into account by using velocity rather than just percentage-based training. So it allows for motivation, fatigue, recovery, and general outputs under load for any given day. As we know, an athlete's strength level can vary 20% on any given day, especially in season. So making sure that we're training based on speed to get a subsequent quality rather than just focusing on the ego and making sure we're just getting a certain percentage for a certain volume in the weight room. But again, Catapult allows us to kind of act as a flashlight into where the athlete's at in terms of their workloads. And then GymAware just symbiotically works with that so that we can use the two together to make sure we're really getting the adaptations we want in the weight room. Next up, so Force Decks. We do baseline assessments as a part of onboarding and then reintroduction to training in the fall. We do in-season home game day assessments, post-competitions the Monday after a game, and then midweek assessments. And it drives deviations from the norm from their baselines and their kind of maximorum testing. And it helps dictate neurological readiness and outputs. So again, it's another technology that we use in congruence with Catapult because it gives us an insight into the neurological readiness and a very general skill like jumping, and kind of cross-comparing that with what their acute daily, their weekly, and then their kind of long-term through the season trends are in terms of stress. And that brings us to Catapult. So obviously we don't have the luxury of bringing the Catapult units in, uploading the data, getting our reports, and then starting lift. The guys come in and they lift right after practice. So we're not looking to create, immediate change based off of that day. That's why one reason it's really important subjectively that I'm at practice is because it allows me just to get a subjective gauge for what practice was like, and also kind of have drive conversations with positions or individuals based on how they're feeling subjectively. But then we can look retroactively at that data more long-term and kind of get a gauge and a map almost to navigate where the guys are at in the weight room. And that can kind of drive decisions for myself, for our athletic trainer, and for our coaches. So again, we're using duration, totals, densities of acute workload, and we're comparing that to the 20-day rolling average. The high speed, distance, and player load, those are the big metrics that I'm looking at for the sport of lacrosse, like I showed you guys in those training reports, and then comparing against athlete and positional averages. So as you guys saw in that first report that I showed in the team reports, attack typically sees much higher workloads than the rest of the team. So that again, it's just objective data from these wearables that allows me to have conversations with the guys or the position groups and gain some more insight into how they're feeling. At the end of the day, nobody knows how these guys are feeling more so than themselves. So their perception of fatigue, their perception of how they're recovering is really important, almost more important than anything else. And Catapult just gives us objective data to kind of drive those conversations and steer them in the right direction. So just lastly, to finish up with the weight room portion, we're flexible in our methods, we're rigid in our principles. Principles are always going to be enhancing athletic qualities, reducing the likelihood of injury, and our weight room kind of flow is always going to be ground-based, three-dimensional, and multi-joint. So again, the biggest bang for our buck, in the weight room using those principles. So we're not chasing our ego, we're chasing our adaptations that we want with minimal effective dose. So using the minimal amount of work to get what we want in the weight room, and kind of undulating that throughout the season based on what the catapult data is showing us and what subjective conversations are telling us. But again, those principles are staying the same. The wearable GPS, it allows for a snapshot into the acute workloads of the athlete, as well as that look into the compounded stress from the tagged activities. So, kind of like I mentioned before, it's really just, it's giving us that broad look into what the athlete's seeing, and the time of the year. It's not really dictating exactly what we're going to do. So I use the analogy of it's a flashlight that allows us to navigate the map. It's not the map itself. And then just one other quick point I just wanted to make, not related to this slide specifically, is going into the time of the year. So obviously we lift 2 times per week. We have optional Tuesday, Thursday lifts as well, just for lower minutes guys. But the big thing is we use catapult heavily to make sure in preseason, we're not undulating stress. So we're actually accumulating stress and we're running stress concurrently. So the guys are seeing, higher volumes from day to day. It's not undulating and going up and down throughout the week like you saw in that first training report. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to accumulate enough and progressively overload their workloads and player load and distances so that they can get up to competition levels by the end of preseason. And then once we get to our competitive period, that's when we're really starting to undulate and manage stress differently. So once they get that accumulated volume in that 3-week preseason period, we start making sure we're undulating those stresses like I talked about in the -5 through -1, and making sure that the guys aren't seeing the same thing over and over again. That prevents staleness, that prevents overtraining, burnout, keeps the guys fresh, and it keeps the stressors aligned from day to day. And then lastly, just quickly touch on this last point, the athlete education. That's a huge part. Like I said, coach first, managing sports science second. And I think education and coaching go hand in hand. And that's something we really drive home at DU, is the education of the athlete and lifestyle management. So that 90% of the week that the athlete's not with an athletic trainer, a strength coach, a sport coach, they're responsible for their recovery and for how they adapt to the stresses put on them. So educating them on nutrition, educating them on, sleep hygiene and healthy sleep habits, and using different technologies and apps to make sure that's in congruence with what we want. And all those other things that go into an athlete's lifestyle. At the end of the day, we're trying to develop good humans, healthy people who know how to take care of themselves. Because, we don't have the luxury of managing 24 hours a day, 7 days a week throughout the whole year to make sure they're doing the right thing. So I just think it's really important to touch on the athlete education portion and the lifestyle management, because, at the end of the day, we're tracking, like I said, 70% of their stress in terms of what they do dedicated to lacrosse. And that's, again, just giving us about 10% of the outlook into their total stress. I think that's a really important point to drive home. But yeah, overall, the wearable technology that we use is, it's imperative for us driving decision-making in the weight room, driving decision-making for drill structure and practice, and making sure that the guys are, reducing the likelihood of injury, but also feeling fresh and healthy on game day so that they can, obviously have good outputs when they get to that competition. So that kind of wraps up my presentation for the day. Look forward to hearing your guys' questions.
Awesome. Thanks, Tim. And encourage everybody, if they haven't already, we've got a few questions coming in now. Post some questions and we'll get through as many as we can in the allotted time. So the first one up is knowing, obviously, the nature of lacrosse and being a bi-weekly competitive schedule, right? So you have possibly a Wednesday and Saturday game. How are you structuring the kind of the load monitoring with that aspect, knowing they have to play 2 games a week?
Yeah. So they actually don't play. They play 1 game per week. And I'll just go back to this slide right here real quick. So that we play on either Saturday or Sundays. The only time we play 2 times per week is during postseason play. Mm-hmm. So the way that we're structuring that through the week and undulating it is, like I said, we're making sure that we're having individual conversations based on those rolling day averages on the individual athletes, as well as positions, and then on the broader spectrum of the team. So we obviously have an outlook for what we want for the team to look like throughout the week. But that's obviously going to vary from individual to individual. So there's things like, the coach in charge of a position group might have a different strategy in how they run drills. So that might increase or decrease the player load stress. We also look at, if playing time and minutes during a game. So if there's a game where we have more substitutions, or we cycle through more lines of midfield or attack or D, versus keeping more guys on the field, that's going to drive decision-making for an individual. But throughout the week, what we're looking for is we're looking to accumulate stress up to that -2, -3, drop it down on that -1 the day before the game, and taper it into a spike on that Saturday or Sunday competition.
Gotcha. And another question came in is, are you looking at additional things? And I know you touched on it within the weight room, but anything with sleep and recovery and mental health and stress, are you guys tracking that as well?
So yeah, we have a lot of teams on HRV for training. We do subjective questionnaires through Google Docs. So that gives us obviously an insight into like kind of broad things that we want to look at. But at the end of the day, I'm a big believer that culture trumps everything. So the culture of education and the culture of how guys carry themselves in that component of things, it's kind of having trust and autonomy with the athlete and allowing them to take ownership of those things. So the subjective questionnaires obviously help give some insight into those things, but they really just act as, red flag indicators into having those discussions with the athletes. But some other things we do are we do food logs. So there's certain guys that are either weight gain, weight loss, body comp guys that'll do food logs throughout the entire year. I have them actually manually write those in with a pen or pencil. I think there's something to be said about kind of doing that manually versus just doing it through a screen. So those lead to discussions about individuals who have individual needs on their nutrition management. And then for sleep hygiene, it's just, again, going back to that education piece. And we do a lot, daily education or check-ins, whether it's pre or post lift, pre or post practice, or onboarding education, where we actually bring the guys in the film room and we do full on PowerPoint presentations on all of those lifestyle management topics.
Gotcha. And with the athletes, with post-COVID, right, if we think about when they come back, how does that approach change, or does it change knowing that they've been away for quite some time?
Yeah, no, it definitely is going to change. Having wearables is going to be a massive influence for us in terms of how we structure that return to performance for a whole team. Typically we're used to doing the return to performance with the wearables with somebody who had an injury. But this is a context where it's an entire team that has to be reintroduced to a completely new and novel stress. So, obviously one of my big mentors and my direct supervisor, Coach Shaw, kind of has put together a loose framework for how we're going to do that. But what we're going to do is we're just going to start introducing stress at a very low level. So in a high-low sequence system. So looking at stress in terms of maybe 50% of normal practice stress on day 1, 40% day 2, off day 3, and then maybe 30% day 4, and then slowly start accumulating that week to week so that we can ideally build up the athlete's tolerance to stress. And luckily we have enough data. So we have about 5-6 years of data for lacrosse specifically that we can look back at to see what typical norms look like for practice stress and kind of build off how we're going to accumulate that when they get back.
Gotcha. And the other one comes in is more kind of who do I monitor? How do I decide that, right? So if we look at obviously your high minute players, beyond that, how are you guys deciding on with the catapult device or just in general how to monitor and what to monitor?
Yeah, so we look at obviously attack, midfield D. We don't track goalies. We don't track Fogos. And then what we do is we track the highest minutes guys, so all of our starters, obviously, and then just work our way back. So guys who are going to get in the mix with moderate minutes, and then any leftover wearables will go to guys who are lower minutes, maybe guys who just go on man up, man down, or guys who get into lesser rotations. But obviously, we don't have the luxury of tracking everybody, but we are able to get really good insight into holistic stress for the team. And one of the other things with that is it can kind of lead to altering training reports based on what knowledge I need to get and what knowledge I need to get to the coaches. So, if we're trying to look at strictly high minutes guys, we have the luxury of kind of taking out the moderate low minutes guys in the training report, because that's going to drastically influence the player loads and the distances based on how much somebody is playing. But we're looking at mainly low, moderate, and high minute guys. Our black squad or developmental squad is not being tracked.
Gotcha. And another question came in, and I think you mentioned that you don't track live in practices, but are you tracking live in game? And how is that change how the coaches are making decisions, regardless if you are or aren't?
So in terms of like live feeds?
Live feed, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, we don't do a live feeds. So I'm out there just kind of manually tracking the start and end times for drills, and then tagging them, retroactively after the fact, and then looking at it from a broader perspective. So we don't have any live feed tracking, but it does drive, decision making for weekly stress, and how we structure weekly stress, how we structure intra-practice stress, so the drill selection and how we sequence that. And we found huge success because, we're structuring practice the same way an S&C coach would kind of structure not only a macro plan, but, a single session where you're doing your high-speed stuff, your technical tactical stuff beforehand, before you get into live scenarios, high stress scenarios, and then finishing with work capacity to make sure those things are structured properly. But we don't do any live feeds.
Okay. And the last question here as we wrap up is, looking at your player load metric, right? With your accelerations over a period of time, what insight has that given to you versus looking at a volume metric like total distance an athlete has traveled?
So could you just repeat the first time? It kind of broke up for a second.
Yeah, no worries. So with comparing player load versus distance, right? What value, when you incorporate player load into your reports, are you seeing versus looking at a total distance metric?
Yeah. So we look at both, but the big thing with total distance, is that it's, if we're just looking at total distance, it's not taking into account the context of that distance. So that could be walking from drill to drill. That could be, just the total covered space that the athlete sees. Whereas when we look at things more like high speed distance or high velocity metrics, it allows us to see the things that are going to, create the most neurological stress and fatigue, as well as the higher tissue stress. And then player load, obviously just giving us more of an insight into the total systemic stress that the athlete's seeing, vertically, laterally, in all different planes, as well as looking at what that looked like in terms of the intensity of each drill and the intensity of that given day.
Perfect. Well, Tim, thank you very much. I really appreciate the presentation. We will obviously be posting this on the Catapult community website, as I posted in the thread, but I really appreciate your time today.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate you having me on here. Hope you guys took something from it.
Definitely. So if you go ahead and stop sharing your screen, and then we can get Justin, next presenter up. We'll have him speak here. So Justin Kilian joins us. He is the assistant professor of exercise science, as well as the assistant coach of women's and men's lacrosse teams at Liberty. So he handles two hats, wears multiple hats, and comes in with a pretty unique perspective of being not only a professor, but also a assistant coach, so can balance both of those. Also works in both gym and hospital settings, so he's bringing in this really great perspective on what's practical and what works in different environments, right? He also recently completed his doctorate. So welcome, Justin, and thank you for your time today.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to be here, and definitely looking forward to going through some of this content with everyone that's tuned in today. So just to give kind of a little bit of a brief background, this is a topic that's really exciting to me. I'm completing my dissertation this summer with the activity monitoring using the Catapult player technology. And it's been really exciting over the past year to dig pretty deep into what our women's lacrosse team is doing here at Liberty University. And before that, I've had the experience here at Liberty going through and kind of developing our strength and conditioning education program. So it's been exciting to have both sides of it. I work with students as they learn and grow on the academic side, and then be able to take that content that I teach and be able to apply it over on the team side. And it sometimes gets a little hectic bouncing back and forth between the two, but honestly, I wouldn't have it any other way. I love having that bridge between what I read and some of the science and articles and things, and then being able to apply that once we get back to the actual athletes. So this presentation really goes along those directions, and it has some scientific background, some of what the scholarly research says, and then what do we do with that? It answers that question. So with that being the case, I definitely appreciate Catapult for having me on, and hopefully as we go through this, you'll be able to take a few things away. Starting out, the idea of training and competition and peaking performance is obviously first and foremost on our minds. If we're not looking at having high levels of performance, then I think we're probably missing something. So typically the way that we approach that is we have to train hard to prepare. We have to make sure that we can manage that workload. And then that way, once we get into our competitions, we can really step it up and we can make sure that we are at our peak performance. So a lot of times when we think about training, we're thinking about the physiology of training. We're thinking about all of those adaptations that we get, all of the periodization that we pour into it is so that we have this basic fitness foundation that we can then apply to the activity parameters of whatever sport we're in. So in this case, obviously lacrosse is going to be something that we're familiar with. We can take a look at the activity patterns within play. We understand how the quarters are broken down, or in this case with women's lacrosse, how the halves are. And we can see kind of the dynamics of the game. And sometimes it can be viewed as sequential. So it can be viewed as more you train, you get the physiological adaptations, you put them into the sport, and therefore the performance is going to be higher. But what I want to approach today is looking at a little bit less of a linear sequence and a little bit more of an integrated sequence where physiology certainly influences activity and performance, but it may not be all in a line. It might be a little bit more dynamic than that. So the interacting factors that we're looking at here are, first of all, the physiology. So these are going to be the internal fitness characteristics. So a lot of times we'll call that internal load, as you know, and these are going to be the things that are a little bit more based on the internal aspects that the athlete possesses and how the training that we go through actually influences those things and puts that load on the athlete. Then we also have external load, and this is how that physiology is expressed. So this is what we see on the playing field. Once we get out on the field, once we see our athletes actually playing lacrosse, whether it's in practices and drills or whether it's in competition, this is the external load. And we'll give examples of these as we move forward with the presentation. And then ultimately there's performance. So these are the sport-specific hard endpoints that we could have a great physiological profile, we could have a comprehensive understanding of the activity profile, but if that doesn't actually lead to goals and assists and cause turnovers, and if that doesn't lead us to possessing the ball more so that we can actually excel at the sport, then there's a piece of the puzzle that's missing, and we need to make sure that we get that grasp of things. So as we go into the next slide here, this is kind of the model that I approach any of the sport performance that we do here at Liberty with. We have to take into consideration the physiological profile, and that has to do not only with our own direct observations. Obviously, every team is going to be slightly different. Every team is going to have a certain dynamic in terms of what the emphasis is, the strategies, and all those types of things. But ultimately, based on not only what we see in front of us with our own teams, but also some of the other teams that are out there. Normative comparisons. On the left side here from Hoffman and Lacrosse, there's a couple of research articles that are out there that provide some of the background. So we get a general idea of what some of these physiological parameters are. That gives us kind of a ballpark estimate to say, okay, where should we be? What are we shooting for as we prepare? And that's where some of this long-term load monitoring comes in. It gives us direction. It gives us a target to shoot for. And then on the other hand, we get activity profiling. This is going to be a little bit of a newer development. And this is where kind of my primary interest lies. And there's a couple of articles that have recently come out over the past few years that have some general averages. Now, obviously, like I said previously, every team is going to be different. So as you take a look at some of the averages that are in the research, we can make some comparisons. We can take a look at like the first article there and the third are in men's lacrosse. International, the first one is from Japan, and then the third one there is from Australia. And then we see that that's expanding into women's lacrosse as well, which of course is my primary area of interest on this topic. And we have the Hauer article that looked at the Austrian national team. And then in NCAA here, the Devine article just really recently came out looking at an NCAA Division I program. So we can kind of get a grasp of what happens overall. And it doesn't have to be in a research article. It can be just communicating with colleagues, just different experiences at different universities as you transfer between jobs and things like that. But overall, I like the broad background that says, okay, approximately where should we be? And then that provides the background context for when we actually look at what's right in front of us, the team that we're actually working with. Now, those two things, like we said, that should lead into sport-specific skills, and that should be integrated into our overall concept of where are we headed, sport performance. So that's the theoretical framework that backs this entire presentation and just kind of gives you an idea of where I'm coming from. So this is a quote from an article that I really appreciate, and it can be really easy as we start to get into things that we go kind of too far down any one trail and we get really excited about one particular thing that can be really useful. But ultimately, athlete behavior, and you could substitute performance or on-field behavior, whatever you want to kind of understand that as, but ultimately it's a result of systems within systems. In other words, these things are all integrated, and we can't take a look at any one thing in isolation. We can't have any one thing on an island. We can't look at physiology without understanding the activity patterns of the sport. We can't look at the fitness and the load of the athlete without understanding what some of the psychosocial aspects of that overall stressor on the athlete are. So ultimately, what we're looking at is a system. So any of the things that we cover, I want to always remember to think about it in that system. So first of all, just a quick background on the physiological profile. These are things that you are all measuring, all the time. These are things that we know about. Some of the examples, looking at things from VO2 max, obviously maximal aerobic capacity is relevant, but we look at lacrosse and obviously it's a sprint sport. So it's a lot of back and forth. It's a lot of high intensity with a little bit of low intensity, high intensity back and forth. So as you look at the intermittent nature, anaerobic capacity, speed, power, strength, all of these things become relevant. And that's where we can create our batteries, our testing batteries. Then if we have the absolutes, we can understand a little bit better the strategy of the game. So as you look at things like substitutions, if you have a midfielder who is just cruising up and down the field, really helping out with transitions, fast breaks, everything like that, we can substitute that. We can provide a little bit of a reserve to manage that load in a real-time setting. Same thing with timeouts. There's been numerous occasions where head coach, she'll call a timeout and she'll be like, all right, I don't have anything groundbreaking to say right now, but get your legs back underneath you, catch your breath, get in the right mental space, and then that way we can go out to the next play and just be that much more prepared. So even in real time, we kind of already intuitively manage those loads that are happening, both internal and external. But in this case, we're looking at more internal. Other things, zone versus man, or any other combinations that you look at in terms of just the style of play. What is actually happening on the field? How does that change from one game to the other? So some of the other things that we'll take a look at are going to be the absolute versus relative. And this is where I take a look at it as, is the maximal expression of fitness absolutely necessary? So in other words, let's say you can sprint and you're the fastest person on the team, and yet you can easily sprint so fast that you take yourself out of the play. So as we look at the load to say, okay, this athlete is consistently hitting their top speed, we also have to look at it as, is that top speed relevant to the context that we need it in? Because it could be that that external load on the athlete is going to be very, very relevant. It's going to lead to scoring opportunities. There's actually a study from FIFA a couple years back that was looking at the percentage of scoring opportunities that stem from sprint efforts. So you take a look at that and it's like, yes, we absolutely need speed. However, what happens if that speed is the speed of the game, but it's relative, so sub-maximal for that particular athlete? Do we need to ask that athlete to work harder, or are they hitting their speed exactly what the game requires? So that's where we can combine these two things of our physiological load on the athlete, but also the external monitoring of what that load looks like in the context of a game. And of course, that leads into sport-specific skill. So if you have a high lacrosse IQ, sometimes working smarter is better than working harder. So that's where we have to be cautious to say, okay, as we monitor the physiological load, it might look like for certain athletes that they need to work harder. They need to take a little bit higher effort. And yet we take a look at their outcomes, the hard endpoints that we discussed previously, and we realize that it might be smarter work rather than harder work. On the flip side of that, you have the lazy superstar where, they just purposely cut corners, they purposely go through. We've had a couple of those over the years, and that's a little bit outside of the scope of the physiological versus the activity profile. That might be a little bit more of the psychosocial profile, but obviously it's relevant. So kind of all within that systems approach that we just covered, these are things that we need to consider. So this is the physiological side. And then we can see some of the just trends. This is just a quick overview. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here because ultimately you folks are familiar with it based on your own sports, your own metrics, and all the teams that you're working with. But this just kind of gives you an idea here. As we see, there's a whole bunch of lacrosse examples. We can compare that to other sports that are arguably fairly similar, just being the intermittent nature sports. But we can see that even within the sport of lacrosse, with these three women's sports, these three women's teams here, we can see there's a lot of differences. So even just in VO2 max, in the peak power, so there's a lot of ways that we can take a look and provide some background context, but the specific application still has to come down to the specific application of these physiological profiles within the specific context of the sport team that we're working with. So that's where it's a good starting point, but it's not the end of the line. Same thing with activity profiles. So we take a look at some of the examples that we have. These are metrics that we on the team take a look at from our load monitoring as we do our wearables in practice and game scenarios. But we also have to consider individual fitness, because for certain athletes on the team, their total distance is astronomical during a given practice because they never stop moving. So for that athlete, it might be a little bit more normal for them to have a higher distance, and it might be that that's easy for them to recover because relative to their maximum capabilities, that total distance really isn't all that challenging. So to use an extreme example, kind of outside the sport of lacrosse, if you compare a power lifter to a marathoner, they're on the opposite ends of the spectrum. So if you take a look at a power lifter and look at some of the, if they do even a brief running program, that's going to be a very, very big change and a very different load on that system compared to a marathoner. So in this way, the same thing can be true as you look at the continuum of athletes and their backing physiological status. Their activity profile or the pattern of play is going to be different. So specific to each individual athlete is actually how we approach load monitoring. So individual fitness matters. The pattern of load also matters. So that we had talked about this a little bit, Tim had touched on this, with where you look at a couple of different examples together. So not just total distance, but also sprint distance or distance per minute or player load per minute was one thing that he brought up. So these are the types of things that we have to have context. The other component is just a couple brief ones here. Performance benefit. Are we looking to maximize performance by monitoring this load so that we can recover enough to enhance our preparedness? Or are we looking for a training benefit? Fatigue in and of itself is not a bad thing. It's just a contextual thing. Is it something that we can manage it where we don't have to peak for a couple of days? Or is it something more acute where we definitely want to have more of a performance benefit than a training benefit? Same thing with high minute versus low minute players. It could be that we're more accepting of a fatiguing load, a higher external load for a low minute player because we're pretty confident they might not be relied upon as much in the subsequent game. Versus a high minute player, we might want to manage that a little bit more intently as we prepare for competition. So just a couple of breakdowns, a couple of different ways to think about it. So in the total distance, this is just a breakdown from one of the articles I referenced earlier, where we can see the differences in position. So we have attack, midfield, defense, of course, and goalies were excluded from this. And we can see that on the left, defense is going to obviously have higher than attack and then midfield for the total distance. And then we can see a pretty similar activity pattern on the right with the sprint distance, but we can also see the absolute loads. So even though it's pretty close, attack and defense end up having a lot higher on the lower end of the speed continuum. And then we look at defense where that is maintained. So not only do they cover a greater total distance, but their sprint distance, that blue bar right there, is actually pretty high as well. And we can make some of those comparisons. And that's where the specific context of not just one thing in isolation, but kind of the whole activity profile as a comprehensive profile rather than an isolated profile. So that's one example of how you can take a look at it. In terms of total distance and sprint distance, these are just some of the data that you can take a look at without going too far in depth down the scholarly research bunny trail. You can see that it's different. That's the main purpose that I want to identify here. So as we look at these three teams that are represented, there's a lot of differences in terms of the total distance, in terms of the sprint distance. Sometimes it can be a little bit harder to compare from one team to the next based on how you define your sprint distance. You can see three different parameters there. And that, again, I would go back to the individualization. So there's the standard metrics that they have that Catapult has set, but you can also adjust that. So you could make it based on game data. You know, what indicates a sprint? Maybe it's 80% of their game speed and above, or whatever it ends up being that's contextualized to the sport, to the team that's right in front of you. So as we go into some of the specific principles, some of the specific applications that I want to get into here, these are 5 principles, 5 questions that you should really answer before getting into exactly how you want to integrate load monitoring into your coaching philosophy and your training philosophy. So the first thing that's important to us is to be effective. Essentially, it's a cost-benefit ratio. As we take a look at, is the training benefit going to be worth the time that we invest in it? It's going to be something that we want to have those hard performance outcomes that we had talked about previously. The second thing is focus. So we want to make sure that the measurements are relevant to the areas that we really, really want to focus on, because we could have some of the superfluous areas of fitness that we address, but maybe it's the wrong time of the year. As you look at your training sequence and you go through your periodized programming, you're not going to look at everything all year long. There's going to be certain metrics that are more relevant in season, and there's going to be other metrics that are more relevant out of season. So this is where we want to make sure that what we're measuring is actually assessing our priorities. Otherwise, we're going in multiple different directions, and it's not always going to have the greatest bang for our buck. Number 3 is contextual. So we talked about this a little bit, but this just brings in a couple more areas or variables that we want to focus on. So we need to make sure that we understand the context that we're applying these parameters in. So things like the age, not only the age of the athlete chronologically, but also their training age. Are they brand new to the sport? Are they brand new to training? We want to take a look at, obviously, the sport. So today we're talking contextually about lacrosse, but these recommendations and the exact training load and the patterns and how we monitor that may differ for other sports. So we need to make sure that we're not overextending or overgeneralizing the experience that we have with one sport and taking it into another sport. The fourth thing is useful. We have to make sure that the load monitoring techniques are both logical, so they make sense. It's not something that's so far-fetched or something that's so overly complicated that it doesn't have a right fit, but it also has to be reliable. It has to be something that we can rely on from one practice to the next, from one week to the next. It can't be highly fluctuating in terms of the results that we get. And the fifth one, the final thing that we want to make sure that we understand in our principles as we decide how to integrate load monitoring is it has to be accessible. And I'd say this is probably one of the most important ones, because whether you're a coach, whether you're a sports scientist, whatever your position is, if you take the data and you present it in a way that the coaches or whoever you're presenting to don't understand, they can't get the take-home message, they can't really understand where you're coming from, you've done a lot of work without direct application. It doesn't really lead to decision-making. But if you kind of flip that on its head and say, okay, here's the essence of what we need to look through. As the sports scientist, you take a look at the content that you really need to focus on. You translate that into actionable content that the coach can implement on the field of play to make practice schedules, to make sure that we enhance preparedness. That's where it really comes to a full head. And it says, yes, everything that we've gone through, all of the other principles, there's a whole purpose behind it that has an outcome that is clear, it's accessible, and it's something that the coaches can really get behind. Not only the coaches, but the athletes as well. The athletes can understand that, I mean, simplistically, even things like they feel better, right? And that's where some of the subjective monitoring can complement, right? We talked about the systems approach, can complement some of the load monitoring that we're doing in terms of intrinsic and extrinsic load. So these are 5 principles to consider. They can be applied to a lot of different direct applications, but this is the big picture view. So we move through this, and then we get into the exact nature of how we're going to integrate load monitoring. So primary purposes, these are pretty consistent as you read through the literature. And I think probably if I were to do a quick poll right now, I think we'd probably narrow it down to approximately these 3 things. Now, they're not the only things. There's a couple other things that you can do as well, but reducing injury risk, right? We know about overtraining and things like that. We know about changes in workload. So we don't want to have our athletes injured, because then obviously they're not on the field, they're not performing to their greatest extent, and that's going to be problematic for them. We want to prevent overtraining. So this is going to be something where we can monitor the programs, we can evaluate them for their effectiveness. So these are some of the primary purposes. The exact methods that we're going to go through are tracking individual trends. So we have to take a look at the athlete. We have to compare it not only to the athlete, but also to some of the team averages, the position averages. Again, that gets back to the context, but then we don't have to remove the athlete from their individual capabilities, right? It's all connected. Their individual fitness level or physiology, the actual activity on the field where that physiology is expressed, and then it puts it into the long term of how does that change over time. So what that can do is help plan practices. So we like a drill stratification system. That's one of the things that I've been working on as I work with the team, is to say, okay, when we go through and choose specific drills, not only does it have to do with the coach's preferences, things that they need to work on based on watching film and things like that, but it also has to do with the overall load monitoring. So a more strategic type practice or drill, depending on how you manage the practices, is going to be lower load, lower fatigue. So these are things that can easily be integrated closer to game scenarios. These are the things that, as Tim had mentioned, we want to have probably when the athletes are fresh. So game acclimatization is the next level up. That's where we want to kind of match where the athletes experience their physiology during a game setting. And of course, that can happen by going back to game data and saying, okay, player load, total distance, sprint distance, all those types of things. We can compare our practice data to the game data and say, how do these things compare? And then the training stimulus would be on the upper end of that. So our girls get up early, they start practice at 6, and on the conditioning days, which they do twice a week in the off season, they're going to have a lot more focus on the high load, right? But it's also high fatigue because they're doing high intensity, they're doing pretty long duration or high quantity, and that's going to be a good training stimulus, right? It's going to probably surpass what they're going to experience in a game, but that's because we're looking for a training effect rather than what we would see more in the in-season period of a maintenance effect, where we want to kind of match the game setting. We want to avoid detraining, but we don't want to provide such a high load that the athlete isn't ready to go once we get back around to the game scenarios, which are typically later in the week or weekends. So then strategic rep allotment. This is something that I've been working with the coaches to implement. And a lot of times the easy thing is to say, okay, high minute players, the high skill players, we want to make sure that we lean in on them. We want to make sure that they rise to their greatest potential. And that's where you also have to say, okay, what about the cost of every additional rep? And it's hard to say, it's hard to quantify the performance benefit of getting one more rep, right? So it's a matter of skill acquisition is important, yes, but we have to track the total load on the athlete as well. We have to make sure that we're not creating more fatigue than we are the skill acquisition benefit. So it's just basically a balance. Some of that comes down to judgment, but also trends of the individual athlete. So another thing, probably many of you are familiar with this, you probably use this, but it's a good thing to integrate here is the acute to chronic workload ratios. So this is just essentially saying, how does workload change over time? And the principle behind this of comparison is to say, does your past training load give you the support, give you the fitness level to be able to handle your current training load? So a lot of times we see either a 1 week acute to a 3 week chronic, or sometimes a 4 week chronic. There's a lot of different research out there, but 3 or 4 week chronic is typically pretty standard there. So this is just a quick snapshot of some of our in-season work. And you can see that there's not a lot of upward progression. There's going to be a lot more of the in-season maintenance, where we're looking at decreasing coming up to a game. That way we can manage the workload, and then games we peak a little bit. But just from, you can see on the chart there, the February 9th to February 11th, you can see that the girls had a day off after the game, and then they come back, they hit it really hard, and you can see some of the back and forth that they get, where we're trying to maximize the effect, but also minimize the fatigue, or at least manage the fatigue. So this can be done. The chart right here shows the player load, which I know you're familiar with. There's a definition there if you're not familiar with it, but this is one of the things that the coaches have really grasped. They really appreciate this metric that Catapult has integrated into their monitoring with the wearables. Other ways to do it though, session RPE, right? So it has a little bit more of a subjective nature to it. And these two things can be used concomitantly. So you can have the session RPE multiplied by the duration of the setting of the session. And then you could also use the player load monitoring at the same time, because the objective and subjective might not match 100%. There might be athletes who are feeling a lot more fatigue and they just do what they have to do, but their session RPE is going to be a whole lot higher than maybe we want it, especially if we're moving towards a game setting. So this is just a quick chart from the 2016 article. Ideally, we're looking at that sweet spot, right? We don't want to go so far above and beyond in a given week. We don't necessarily want to have that shock on the system. That's where some of the injury risk increases. The sweet spot, kind of give or take that 1.0. And again, this is going to be contextual, because as we go into a season, we're probably going to be more in a maintenance. So we're probably not going to be having a ton of progression. Whereas in the off season, we might want to be having a little bit more progression, but that's where you monitor the workload. You make sure that your rate of progression isn't too much for the athlete to handle, right? They don't come back from a break and all of a sudden you're doing 200% of what they were doing before, right? So this kind of gives a sweet spot there that we can fall back on. So comparison, as we look at some of the specific applications that we've been talking about, in my opinion, comparison is the key to sports science. So this is where we have to take a look at what the athlete is doing, but how do you determine what is a good measurement and what's not, right? It's individualized. We need to make sure that we understand where this athlete has been. We need to understand what the future goals are and where this athlete is going. And we need to understand exactly where we are in the periodized program, because what is good might actually be bad if we translate it to a different season. So in other words, our in-season work is not going to be exactly the same as our off-season work. We need to understand the context. And that's how we get progress. So we have to have our macro in place so that we can understand exactly what we're doing at the time of year that we're doing it. So that helps us establish training requirements. That's how we plan our programs, and that's how we can integrate this concept of load monitoring into practical application with the daily practice schedules, with the lift schedules, with the conditioning schedules. So we have to make sure that we're maximizing fitness and minimizing fatigue. So that goes into, when we do that, we are maximally prepared. So that gets into some of the concepts that, just kind of mentioning and bringing up here, minimal essential dose. So if we are doing more work, so more training volume than is necessary to elicit the adaptations that we're looking for, really what we're doing is we're not getting any extra physiological benefit, but what we are doing is creating more fatigue. So that goes into the maximal recoverable volume concept, where we take a look and say, okay, how much can we do where we can still recover from it and be better for it, versus if we do a whole bunch of volume, yeah, maybe the athlete is still standing on the other side of that, and maybe we're looking at our metrics and it fits exactly the progression that we want, but ultimately the athlete isn't ready to go for the next high intensity training practice, or worse, if they're not ready to go for a game or scrimmage scenario. So some of the examples that we implement here at Liberty are going to be from game to game. So I'll present to the coaches and say, okay, how does this athlete prepare in one game versus another? And there's some examples of athletes that sometimes they just show up to a much greater degree and their workload is much higher in a given game, in which case you got to make the recommendation that they might need a little bit more recovery than is necessary. And that's where I can work with the athletic trainer that we have on staff here and say, hey, these athletes have, 10, 20, whatever % higher workload than we typically see from them in a game setting. Maybe work with them a little bit more on some of your recovery strategies off the field. We could also do in-game. So first half to second, that's a little bit more feasible if you are in a setting where you're doing live tracking. What we do is more hindsight. So we take a look at some of the trends, how athletes can either maintain from first half to second. Typically what we see is more of a decline, as you would guess. And some of the references that I had earlier, they show more of a decline. But that's where some of the strategies can come into place, that if we know somebody goes all in the first half, maybe we can manage their load in the first half a little bit more so that we maybe get them a couple of subs in an occasion so that they can be full, or at least as close to full as possible in the second half and still be a contributor as a high minute player. We can do practices compared to games, and I've got some examples of that coming up. And then same thing, activity profile. So we'll look at some examples of this, relative versus absolute, and then internal, external load, and then finally return to play. So this is really where the practical application comes in, and we're going to dig into each one of these as we move forward. So this is a busy slide, and it's kind of meant to be that way. There's a lot that we can do with this, but if you just take one of those athletes across the bottom, so I just have them listed as different athletes. Obviously we have our different positions, midfield, attack, defense, and the numbers just represent different athletes. So even if we just take a look at the first athlete on there, midfielder number 1, we had 30 minutes of 77. So this kind of replicates pretty close to what we have in terms of a game setting for a half. So we can see what the athletes do in practice. That would be all of the blue bars as you go across. But then we can see the first half and the second half, and that's where the game 1 comes in, game 2, so on and so forth. So this is a comparison that we can have to say, how close does an athlete get to their actual game setting as we go through practices? And some of the athletes, you can see that blue bar is pretty far below. Some athletes, it's a little bit higher. So as we track that, sometimes it's going to be a motivational thing. Sometimes it's just a matter of giving the athlete the confidence to say, hey, this is a good training stimulus. Jump in when we're going 7v7, play it like a game. Other times we take a look at an athlete and say, hey, we're just trying to get the game strategy. We need to pull you back a little bit. So don't go all in. Nothing's on the line here. We're just trying to rep the offense, or we're trying to rep the defense, or whatever the case is. So a lot of this comes down to, again, context. We have to systematically integrate the load monitoring with the actual practice plan and what we're trying to do with it. So this is just another way to look at the data. This specifically goes into sprint distance. So for us, we define that sprint distance greater than about 11 miles per hour. So we take a look at the distance, and each of these, again, is separated out by the athletes on the left side as we look the vertical axis. So we've got midfielders, we've got attack, we've got defense. And then we can see that for a game, as we go through the games, we can not only compare one game to the next to see how that athlete responds in a game setting. Ideally, we want to see it relatively consistent, because if there's something that is inconsistent, that means something has changed. Now, it might be a change for the better, and we need to evaluate that, but it also might be a change for the worse. It might be because of a nagging injury that we need to dig deeper on. It might be because of maybe a lack of confidence. Somebody has been doing really well in practice and has been getting some extra reps in games. Maybe we need to speak some truth into that athlete about they're the starter for a reason, and we have every confidence. We're just trying to support their effort. There's a lot of different scenarios and what ifs that you can go through, and that's where we can't let the data be king. We have to use the data. The data is a tool to help us get to the bottom of what we need to do on the field. So the other component here that we had talked about is going to be comparing games to practices. So again, this is going to be time equated. This is going to be basically scrimmaging in a game setting, in practice though. So that's where we can see things in orange, and then the final bar in there in that kind of bluish tealish color. So we can make some comparisons. Do we actually drop off in intensity 2 days before a game, right? Versus a day after a game? Those are things that probably we're not going to have a super, super high load based on the preparedness and recovery. So we can make sure that our practice plans and how we intend for things to happen are actually happening that way. So this is where it provides us good accountability to understand exactly what we're doing on the field, and it gives us that objective data to back it up. Another thing, just looking at total distance and speed zones. So we're looking at an attacker. So this is from the same game. One of our attackers, so this is one of our top attackers and one of our top midfielders. So we're looking at the player load being relatively similar. Attacker covered a little bit more distance in this case, but they're both high minute players. And you can see that the distance is going to be fairly comparable, but some of the parameters within that distance are maybe changing a little bit. Specifically, draw your attention to the speed zone 5. So you can see the speed range that is 28 meters compared to 145 meters, right? Now, maybe that's relevant, maybe not, but you can see that that's going to be a difference. And if we look at only total distance by itself, we might miss that. So again, an integrated approach where we're looking at a variety of metrics, trying to come up with a comprehensive conclusion about what the data is actually communicating to us. So it takes a lot of interpretation. Another thing, so this is going to be something that we can also do. We can compare the athlete to the team averages. So this is one of our, actually it was the same athlete that was the attacker. And this is the way that she contributes to the team in terms of her player load. So you can see the metric is player load. The training is going to be the team averages, and that's the blue bars are going to be practices, green bars are games, and then the individual player is listed as the little circles there that are in that kind of orangish color. So as I look through this, the first thing that jumps out to me is going to be the anomalies. So what's different than what we would expect? And that's right here. The rest of the time, this athlete is typically above and beyond what the team does. Her workload is higher, she's a hard worker, and on this one particular day, she's not. So what happened there? Is there something that she's nursing? Is there something that, some chronic injury that's kind of in the background that we need to be aware of? It doesn't appear to be that. Just because she had a good game, she went down a little bit, bounced back relatively quickly. So maybe she just was under recovered for that day. Maybe she intentionally took herself out of reps for one reason or another. So there's a lot of things that you can do to dig deeper. And that's where this comparison is. The team averages give us a ballpark of where we think we kind of should be. And then the individual trends can also be complemented there. So this is another one, taking a look at combining the internal and external load. So we've looked at these individually up until this point a little bit more, but now this can be a good integration. So this is a diagram that I had pulled from a 2017 study, and we can see that the appropriate work rate to cost ratio is for athletes 1 through 4, right? So basically it's what we would expect to be the case. The one that I want to, or the two that I want to focus on is the concerning work to rest ratio, or the work rate to cost ratio, which is athlete number 5, where we're not really getting a whole lot out of that athlete, right? But the cost for that athlete is very high. So this is, as we monitor that workload, as we take a look at the percent maximum heart rate, it's going to be really high, but we're not really getting a lot of high speed running out of that athlete in terms of absolute performance. So as we look at that, that's an athlete that we might want to pull into their own separate program, add some additional foundation, versus the opposite of that is athlete number 6, where we're getting a high output. They are just killing it on the field. They're getting a ton of high speed running, but it's not at a high cost to that athlete, right? So it could be that these two athletes, 5 and 6, are going through the exact same practice, but they're responding to that training load differently. That's where we can individualize things for the athlete. And it might be that our training load is spot on. It's exactly where we need it to be. The problem might be with athlete 5, right? Or it might be the opposite way, where we need to adjust what we're doing because it's just too hard for the athlete, right? That's something for you guys to decide. So return to play, that's another one that we can see here is going to be something that might not be 100% depending on your role, but working with the athletic trainer, this is one of our goals for the future, to be able to say, what does an athlete experience in game? And if they're going to get back into a game setting, we need to be pretty close. And in this chart, you can see all the way on the right side there, they're 98% of the way there, but they need to be pretty close to what their game measures are before they go back to that stimulus and are exposed to that level, that magnitude and volume of play. So in this case, you can see the rehab session number. There's a general progression as we go pretty close to the injury on the left side. We get further away from the injury on the right side, and we can see that that athlete is getting pretty close to what their max speed was prior to that injury. So just another way that we can take a look at the external load on the athlete and what that looks like as they get back on the field of play. So if you're interested, you can contact me directly. These are just some of the resources that I pulled out. And I just want to say thank you. I appreciate your time. I appreciate you listening to what I have to say and hope you took something away from it. If you have any follow-up questions, I know we have some time for questions here, but if you have any follow-up questions, I'd be happy to be involved in that way. And you can reach out to me It's just my personal Instagram account or my school email. Either way, I'd be happy to respond. Thanks.
Awesome, Justin. I really appreciate your time in the presentation here. We do have a couple questions as they come rolling in. I'm sure we'll have a few more. One of the questions that came in a little bit earlier in your presentation was around the meetings with the coaches and, how do you integrate some of that data and how does that change those decisions? How are the coaches receptive or not receptive in certain situations based on what the objective data is showing them?
Yeah, that's a great question. And honestly, I've been pretty blessed because I was originally a goalie coach with the women's team. And then I got a grant to cover the player tech devices. And so I brought it to them. I was like, hey, I would love to just provide this for the team. I would love to dig in. And they were so supportive of it. They're exciting. They're very driven. So there was already kind of a good appeal for the product and the concept as a whole. So I didn't have to go through and provide the base layer of getting buy-in. They kind of already had it. The main question that I was addressing with the coaches was, what are we going to do with it? They're like, we know we can do something. There's a lot of high quality teams that are using it, but what do we do with it? And so we spent the off season, so the fall semester, we spent about 2 hours a week. And essentially, it was probably a good role for me because I am a professor and I lecture a lot, but I just presented the ideas of what we can do with it. So I just gave them a lot of visuals. I gave them a lot of concepts. Some of it was actually included in this presentation. So I gave them my area of expertise, but I also deferred to their judgment to say, what's important to you? What do we need to do? And as we worked through that about 2 hours a week of the fall semester, it started to kind of hone in. They gained a greater understanding for kind of my wheelhouse. I was able to gain a little bit more understanding on their coaching philosophy. And ultimately what it ended up being, I think I mentioned it earlier, but it ended up being player load was really one of the primary things that they were interested in to take a look at, to say, okay, if we're having an easy practice, is it actually easy? If we're having a complicated practice, is it actually something that we can have that technical proficiency without fatigue? Or the reverse, if it's supposed to be hard, can we make it harder? And that was one of the primary things that we were able to do, that some of the intentionally hard practices really weren't as hard as they expected because there was a lot of coaching and teaching between the hard drills. So like the minute by minute player load, yeah, that was hard. But because there was some teaching time, chalk talk, that kind of stuff on the field between, they were able to condense some of that and increase the player load for the session. So yeah, ultimately, they really appreciated the visuals and they really appreciated options. So they didn't feel pigeonholed into any one direction. They could integrate what I was communicating with them into their own coaching philosophy.
Gotcha. And how long, like in terms of duration, was it that they came around to it, or was it saying like, let's start slow and slowly implement it, or show us everything off the get-go? Like, what was their approach that way?
Yeah, the way that we integrated it was immediately. So as soon as we had the devices in hand, I assigned each player with it. Every player got one. We put them on the field and started tracking data. And then as we went through each week, the data that I had, it was kind of like drinking through a fire hose. And I was like, all right, I'm going to throw a ton of stuff at you. Let's see what sticks. And as they started to get interested, as they started to learn, as they started to understand a little bit more about what Catapult could do for their coaching strategies, we started to narrow it down. So it went from a very broad to a very specific. So like now when we meet, it's a lot more condensed. Some of the stuff that they're not as interested in, we don't really talk about that. Whereas some of the stuff that they're very interested in, that's the primary. So like player load is usually the first thing that we talk about. And then we start getting into things like total distance, sprint distance, direct athlete to athlete comparisons, different things like that.
Gotcha. And one came in about the acute chronic work to rest, or sorry, just the ratio, right? And looking at it more from a stats perspective. And they asked, is it coupled or is it uncoupled? Should I use rolling or exponential? Can you provide more insight into how you're implementing that and maybe some nuances if you are using a rolling average?
Yeah, that's a great point, because the rolling average is good if you don't have a lot of fluctuations. So like, for example, if there's an injury, that kind of falls apart a little bit, or if there's a week off or some time off or something like that, it's a little bit rough to try and use that. So that's where multiplying by a factor can get a little bit more precise. because as we know, fitness doesn't immediately decay, right? There's kind of a range that detraining occurs over. So, it's not like if we take a day off, all of a sudden we have to start over with our training. But in terms of the acute to chronic workload, that day off is going to be a big difference as we start to make the calculations. So, I'm by no means an expert or the final authority on this, but my approach is if it's going to be a little bit more consistent in the training, there's no anomalies, then just using the standard method, but the exponential might be a little bit more effective if you have some of those extraneous situations that are built in.
Gotcha. In terms of the athlete buy-in and education piece, how have you guys have gone about that? Has there been resistance? If so, how have you overcome that?
No, honestly, I think it's only really the opposite of that, because we have, I don't want to say kept it from the athletes, but as the coaches have learned what external load monitoring does and kind of integrated it into their coaching philosophy, we've decided not to burden the girls with too much information, because we don't want them coming up and thinking, okay, no, I haven't run as far as somebody else, or, maybe my sprint distance is less or things like that. So we haven't really given them the details of it. We've just given them some of the generalizations about, total workload. And really what we've done is integrated it into our current team culture. So at Liberty, Kelly has developed, she's a head coach, has developed the Team 10. And I think it's really a great foundation, because one of the 10 essential components of a Liberty lacrosse player is the perspective of taking care of yourself. So we just pour into that and say, hey, when we give you feedback or advice on, our load monitoring, it falls under that aspect of our team culture, and that is to take care of yourself. So if we're telling you to do more, that's because we know you can do more. We want to reduce your injury potential. Or if it's maybe to moderate something out, then that's just to say, hey, you're doing plenty. You're doing exactly what we want. Take a step back, because we don't want you doing too much and, toe in the door of overtraining. So it's really, I think, been a pretty seamless integration so far. I mean, we're still fairly early on, but I think as far as generating buy-in, the best thing we did was just put it into our current system instead of trying to say, hey, this is something brand new and different. It's just a different way of doing what we're already doing.
Gotcha. And from a recruitment standpoint, has that changed the coach's perspective a little bit in terms of, bringing in an athlete, understanding the culture that you guys have as a team now, but also the player monitoring aspect and how to objectively assess where an athlete is and where to get them at? Like, has that changed has the player monitoring tool changed the way that you recruit?
Not yet. So in theory, it should. And in the concept of it, that's kind of where we're headed, because we're only pretty new in implementing the technology. We don't have a ton of data to work with, but even some of the ideas that we've had is to, like, during some of the play days or some of our camps and things like that, if we have recruits that are coming in, then we could potentially get a snapshot of what they're capable of, kind of what their work rate is compared to their peers within that camp. So those types of things are definitely on our radar. There's some ideas that we've had, but we haven't really integrated that yet, just because we're pretty new to it.
Gotcha. Understand. And then got one final question here in terms of when you reference the high versus low minute players. What are some ways that, whether you have low minute or no minute players, that you're mimicking game-like intensity? Obviously, replicating that is very challenging. So how do you go about that?
Yeah, one thing that we've tried to do is, a lot of times, just because of the coaching focus in terms of the strategy of the game, we will do 7v7 on half the field. So we'll do it and pretty much everybody's just waiting their turn. But we've discussed ways that we can break that up to maybe do 2 7v7s and have a little bit higher load for some of the low minute players, so that they're not going through too low of a load just because they're waiting for all of the high minute players to get through the drill, and then they're kind of left with whatever's left over. So that's one method. We've also talked about, kind of in a similar context, if we have specific drills, can we, run them from 2 different directions, or we can have 2 of the same drill happening at the same time. So that's one way that we can kind of increase the load. And then this is something that we haven't done a lot of yet, because we just need a little bit more data to understand. But to be able to ask the high minute players to pull themselves out and have fewer reps when we're trying to decrease the overall load, because the general standard on our team is it's a lot of girls that are go-getters. They want to be out there. They love their sport. They're dedicated to the team. So usually we have to hold them back rather than being like, hey, go do more. So in that case, we're taking a look at what the player load is on certain practices and maybe intentionally letting the athletes know to say, hey, I don't want you doing any more than, 4 or 5 reps here because I don't want it to be a high load practice. I want it to be a moderate load practice.
Gotcha. Well, great, Justin. I really appreciate your time and the presentation. Thank you.
Well, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Definitely. And to those attending, we thank you for your time and attending and hope you enjoyed the content. As a reminder, we'll be posting this on the Catapult community website. We have another webinar coming up on Thursday. For those based of us in the States, it'll be bright and early, 5 a.m. Eastern time. So don't take it against you if you want to check out the recording later on. But that one will be also focused on education as well and developing an early career in sports science. So it should be an interesting one. So we will continue these on. So encourage everybody to continue to join in. And thank you again for everybody joining. Have a good day.